Britain now has the highest electricity prices in the developed world. This is nothing to brag about, my friend.
No.
This is nothing to brag about.
Hello and welcome to the Americano Show. Today I am delighted to be joined by Robert Bryce, a friend of the show. As we say here, the Bryce is right.
At Spectator World Headquarters.
Spectator World. He is the author of A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations, and the author of a brilliant Substack, which I recommend all Americano viewers and listeners subscribe to immediately.
Absolutely.
And it's great to have you here in London because the last time we spoke, you were in America. It was down
I think we've only Zoomed before or done online before. We haven't done anything live, but this is great.
Let's talk about your latest. Let's start by talking about your latest Substack post, which I thought was very interesting, about Ford.
Yeah.
And EVs and
Right.
the incredible losses, 17 billion.
Well, so by the end of this year, when you tally all the losses that Ford will have accumulated, because they're projecting another $5 billion loss on electric vehicles this year, they will have lost $17 billion since 2023, 2022. It's just an staggering loss. And I think one of the biggest corporate misallocations of capital and misreadings of the marketplace of anything I can recall. And they're losing now, I think, for all of 2024, I think they lost an average of $50,000 for every EV they sold. And they didn't make it up in volume, right? I mean, it's incredible. But it's not just Ford. I will say what's interesting about Ford is they break out their EV segment from the rest of their reporting, right? So it's very clear they report that separately, and they report their operating losses for the EV segment. The other automakers don't. But we see all across the automotive space, the EV part of their business, all of them are cutting back. All of them are realizing they're not selling, and all of them are taking massive losses. So, some of this was government push saying you have to do this. But the other part of it, though, was just these automakers investing billions without understanding that their customers really don't want these. I mean, there are a few, they're, maybe 10%, 12%, but overwhelming majority don't.
And to what extent was it government push, and to what extent was it government carrot in terms of subsidies? And I mean, they've lost 17 billion, but how much did they get government money to do it? Did they get federal funds to do it?
Well, of course. I mean, yes. I'm of this old mind that corporations don't need government subsidies, but, of course, subsidies and the subsidies and the mandates went together. So Ford, and the other automakers, GM and Stellantis, and then a bunch of foreign automakers came to the U.S. because they got tax credits or loan guarantees or other things that incentivized them in particular to build battery plants. But a lot of that is unraveling now. Part of it is higher interest rates, but also you've got here in Europe and the UK, you've got the reality of Chinese imports and electric vehicles eating into the marketplace, and also higher interest rates and consumers are just and inflation, and consumers are cutting back. So what we see in the U.S. overall, just one last point, the age of the overall car fleet in America is the oldest it's ever been. People are keeping their cars longer. They're not buying. I live in Austin, Texas, so you have to have a car, right? Not like in London, but we have 3 cars, and they're all 12 years old or older.
Yeah.
I don't want a new car right now, but I could afford one, but I'm not going to buy one.
Well, I mean, EVs is a big story in Britain.
Oh, yeah.
Too, and there's been this huge push towards them, a growth of charging stations and so on, a lot of people buying through company schemes and so on.
Sure.
And it felt about 3 years ago as though we were approaching a sort of tipping point where EVs were going to become the norm. I think that slid back a little bit because consumers don't really like them that much overall, I think. But then when you take the American mindset on cars, cars are very fundamental to America in many ways, and to the American story.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Well, and in the U.S., we have nearly as many automobiles as we have people. Yeah. We have 330 million people. We have about 285 or 286 million motor vehicles. And of that, I'd say, I'm just guessing off the top of my head, 98, 99% run on liquid motor fuel, run on petroleum. But I just thinking about where we are. So we're here in central London, and we're staying at a hotel over near Trafalgar. We walked over here, and it's not that far. I didn't pass a single EV charging station. So residents of this part of central London, if they had an EV, where are they going to charge it?
Yeah.
They live in a low-rise apartment building, or flats as you call them here. But where are they going to charge it? So
maybe that's very discreetly designed, and it's hard to spot.
Yeah, well, that may well be, but
still, no, I'm joking,
this is a big problem of that infrastructure. And the way I think about it, I've written about the history of the automotive business a little bit. There's nothing new about the electric vehicle. They were around in Edison's day, and Edison and Ford, and Edison eventually realized this isn't going to work, right? Because the energy density of batteries is so low relative to that of gasoline, jet fuel, diesel fuel. And as I put it, if oil didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. It's just a nearly miraculous it is a miraculous substance.
Yes.
Because of its energy density, cost, weight, ease of handling at a standard temperature and pressure. It's and the final point on that is we forget this massive amount of energy that we consume in the form of liquid fuel. And the idea that we could somehow supplant that or easily switch away from that over to electricity, I think overall it's just a fool's errand.
We talked about government push and pull, incentives and so
Sure.
on. Of course, the big change now is you have a Trump administration that appears to be jettisoning.
It is a big change.
It is a big change.
There is no doubt about that.
But there's a lot of interest in the extent to which the Trump administration will unravel a lot of the Green New Deal incentives that Biden put in place. What's your latest take on what's going on there? What is going to be cut? What is going to be kept? And so on.
Well, let me just first say, this is the biggest U-turn in politics, particularly on the energy side of politics in American history, and there's no second place. It's just, frankly, the fraud and the waste that was happening in energy policy in the Biden administration, the numbers of contracts that were given to favored NGOs like Rocky Mountain Institute, and now a new discovery of a massive grant going to an outfit called Rewiring America to electrify everything, and this was their push. And they were getting government money. And these are the climate alarmists that are effectively planting themselves inside the government of the Biden administration with full cooperation of the EPA and the Department of Energy under Joe Biden. That's all going to be unraveled. But so what's going to happen in the U.S.? We're going to see a sea change, clearly, in terms of energy policy. The Democrats are back-footed in almost every way. They don't have an heir apparent. JD is the obvious heir apparent in the U.S., but I think it's more important than what is happening in the U.S. because, in my view, you look around the world and the election of Trump has had these knock-on effects that are serious. The German coalition government fell 2 days after Trump was elected. And then you've seen the coalition government in Norway, the coalition government in Canada, all fall apart. Now, that's not all Trump, but I think there are multiple factors, Trump being a key one, that have resulted in this move away from climatism and more toward energy realism. And I think it's long overdue. Unfortunately, I think we will, by the time we get a full course correction, consumers and taxpayers will have been forced to waste trillions of dollars.
And the extension of energy realism is what you call energy humanism.
Right.
And you've been here in London giving a talk about that
Yeah.
this week. You did talk about this the last time we had you on, but just explain again what you see energy humanism as being.
Sure.
And why is it a sort of essential thing to understand?
Sure. Well, a fellow writer on Doomberg puts it very clearly. He says energy is life, and the absence of energy is death. And I spoke at the ARC conference a couple of days ago, and I told this story of meeting a woman in rural India about 8 years ago. And in talking to her, her name was Rahena Jamadar, and she lived in this small agricultural village in West Bengal called Majlishpukur. And she lived almost all of her life without electricity. And it was a conversation, and I told the audience, I said, it really did change the course of my life, change the course of my career, how I think about energy and energy poverty. But it was talking to her, and she had her first child when she was 16. She was in her mid-40s, and one of her daughters was going to the university in Kolkata, and she was clearly proud of this. And so we talked a bit more, and then I asked her through my friend Joya Shri Roy, who was translating. I said, well, if you had had electricity when you were young, would you have gone to the university as well? And she immediately nodded and said, yes, I would have gone. And so, you know how it is. You meet people, you think about it, conversations, and a couple of days later, you realize, well, what did this mean? And it came to me a couple of days later when we were in a hotel, and I've had a few minutes to myself. And darkness kills human potential, and electricity nourishes it. And here was a woman who'd seen this opportunity pass her by, and she was clearly very intelligent and could have gone to the university, could have been a doctor, lawyer, who knows, a teacher, a nurse, I don't know. But having cheap, abundant, reliable electricity, having high quality energy is absolutely essential to human development and human flourishing. And so I hesitate to get too theological or philosophical here. Well, no, I don't. Wait, who am I? Wait, stop. No, we're made in the image of God. We have this culture, this ability to create, and if we don't have sufficient energy, we can't do that. We can't fulfill our God-given potential, our creativity, our ability to grow and flourish as humans and reach our full potential is quashed if we're living in energy poverty.
No, we always go philosophical. We like it. We like it a lot. More the better, we say.
Well, bring it on. I don't know.
More energy.
Have we mentioned Kierkegaard? I don't know. Kierkegaard, who did say, "I never had a problem that I couldn't resolve with a good walk." I would kind of like that.
Yeah, well, that's
I don't quote Kierkegaard often, but that's the only Kierkegaard I know.
But you are glad then that I think you can call him, he's a friend of yours, Chris Wright, the Energy Secretary, is very much on board with this message, with this radical rethinking of the way we think about energy and electricity. And the administration is taking this all of the above approach to energy. So if renewables work, do it. If we need to drill more, do it. There's going to be a big we are in the middle of a big technological revolution, which will require ever greater amounts of energy, amounts of electricity, and America needs to provide it cheaply.
Sure. And this is where, I hope we can talk a little bit about Britain, but your Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, saying, Britain's going to lead in AI. And I'm over here I live in Texas. I'm from Oklahoma, not bragging about Texas. I'm thinking, what is he smoking? I mean, is there some kind of, marijuana gummies he's having? How is, Britain is facing this oblivion, truly, when it comes to energy availability, particularly cheap electricity. But back to Chris Wright. I'm just a quick side note there. But yes, I have tremendous respect for Chris. I've known him for a long time. He's an entrepreneur. He's has a technical mind. He knows every part of the energy business. He's been a very successful head of a CEO of a company, Liberty Energy, which is publicly traded, Denver-based hydraulic fracturing company. But as I wrote about when Trump named him as the nominee, I said that he's an unapologetic energy humanist. And finally, we have someone who will be in that job who isn't demonizing energy. And, his predecessor, Jennifer Granholm, she was a Harvard lawyer. It was a political appointment that she had no real deep knowledge. Chris has incredibly deep knowledge. And so he's not only an energy humanist, but I think he's the first person that has ever been in that job as energy secretary to come directly out of the energy industry. Ronald Reagan appointed a dentist. I mean, it's been up till now having actual qualifications and a history in the energy business has been disqualifying for that job. So I'm very excited about that. Now, to be clear, can Chris change a lot and do it in a short time? We will see. But I think the areas where he's going to push hardest are on baseload power and in bolstering the U.S. electric grid, because even though we are in a very good position in the U.S., we're going to need a lot more electricity for AI, for data centers, and economic growth. But I think the thing to watch is going to be the nuclear sector and how quickly the Department of Energy and the rest of the federal government can catalyze growth in new reactor designs and deployment.
And there's a strategic element to it too, because the Trump administration is has its eyes very much on China.
Yeah.
And the rise of China. And we have a fascinating piece in the Spectator this week about China and climate change groups in Britain.
Yeah.
And that China is actually a sort of the funder and the pusher of a lot of climate change rhetoric, anti-climate change
rhetoric. And the Russians were behind the anti-fracking movement in Europe.
Well, quite. Yes, they were. Russia Today, the TV channel, did regular sections on fracking, which seemed a bit odd, but then when you think about it, it's not odd at all. They didn't want fracking to happen because at the time, Russian oil and gas was very important to Europe and Britain.
Right. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, although the new CIA is finally going to release some papers on the Kennedy assassination. But I think it's very clear that, and I had some knowledge of the Chinese support for climate groups, but I look forward to reading a piece. But it's very clear, and Matt Ridley and others have written about these connections between the anti-fracking groups in Europe and the Russians. And of course, the Russians don't want to have Europe producing its own gas. They wanted Europe to, many countries in Europe to remain dependent on Gazprom. And so now here we are, however many years later, we're all these years deep into the Ukraine war, and Europe is in the hurt locker, and overall, because it became too dependent on Russian gas. And now without Russian gas, pipeline gas, which was your cheapest form of available gas, you're having to rely on imported LNG. And I just looked at the price of TTF, which is the Dutch trading hub. It's $14.59 per million BTUs. At Henry Hub in the U.S., it's $4.34. So you're paying, almost 4 times as much. That's almost as much as where you're paying actually more now than the Asian LNG price, the JKM, which is $14.25.
Yes, and in Britain we worry a lot about growth. It's become this sort of unicorn thing, economic growth. Politicians talk about it all the time, talk about how we can possibly achieve it, but it doesn't seem to happen. Probably the most important thing to growth is cheap energy.
Absolutely, full stop.
Yeah.
And when you started to talk about that, I was saying, but you can't have economic growth if you don't have cheap, abundant, reliable energy.
Yeah.
Both for, and particularly in the form of natural gas, but also, making certain that you have cheap, abundant, reliable electricity. And so I've watched now, and Matt Ridley and many others have written about it. At the ARC conference, Paul Marshall mentioned it, who, I understand now owns the Spectator.
Yes.
But Britain now has the highest electricity prices in the developed world. This is nothing to brag about, my friend.
No.
This is nothing to brag about.
No.
You're paying, 40 cents a kilowatt hour. In Texas, I'm paying 13. So you have and Paul Marshall at the ARC conference, I think, I'm remembering off the top of my head, I think he said that now industrial electricity prices in Britain are 5 times the U.S. and 7 times China. How can you have a thriving industry if your costs are that high? And the other he also quoted, and I looked it up just again this morning. Paul Marshall quoted the CEO, the head of INEOS, your chemical company, Sir Jim Ratcliffe. He said recently that the UK chemical industry is facing extinction. Well, if you don't have basic chemicals, that's the basis of industry. And remember, INEOS just in January closed the Grangemouth ethanol plant in Scotland, the last synthetic ethanol plant in Europe. Yes. So Europe is in a very precarious, and does Britain consider itself still part of Europe, or we have to think about this differently here?
No, we're not part of the European Union. But
no, I know, not part of the European Union.
All the advantages that a lot of Brexiteers thought would come from Brexit and not being tied to the European Union, sort of the opposite has happened.
Yeah.
On energy, on immigration.
And the opposite happened. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. I'm sorry.
Well, we thought that we'd get more control of our borders with Brexit, but the opposite seemed to happen.
I see.
And then we thought we would have, more say over energy policy, less interference from Europe, and so on. And in fact, we've become more zealous for net zero. And that was under a Conservative government, and now we have a Labour government, which is worse. But anyway,
and how do you
explain? It's supposed to be the Americana show. But
how do you explain that? Because I've watched. Liz Truss was in office. She had a cup of coffee and then was out. Right, 6 or 7 weeks.
Yeah.
Right, but when she came in, and I thought, as watching from the U.S. as a Tory, I thought one of the first things she said is, "We're going to end this ban on fracking." And then they push her. They throw her overboard, and Rishi Sunak said, "Oh no, we don't want fracking." And so my understanding is that the Tories, who were in theory, the Conservatives pro-growth, they're following the Labour lead on this, what I think is just insane energy policy.
Well, there is no good explanation for it other than the fact our political elite seems to be extremely destructive and probably corrupt and divorced from the working class. Exactly.
Right? And no connection to it, because you've also closed I think the steelworks at Port Talbot. You're closing your last blast furnace. I don't know if it's already closed or not, but that's your last ability to make virgin steel in Britain. What?
Yeah.
I look at it and I think, how can this be that you see this country that has such a proud history in industry and steel making, one of the cradles of the Industrial Revolution, and now, instead of seeing the error and pivoting, It's like the government is pressing on the gas pedal, as we call it, the accelerator.
Well, I mean, I'd love to talk about how gloomy things are in Britain. It's what I do most all day long. But this is supposed to be the Americana.
Oh, right, Americana, right, yes,
but,
of course.
I think let's talk a little bit about not just America, but globally, the environmentalist movement now.
Yeah.
It feels like the advent of Trump is a big defeat for them, which it is.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's a very compelling, almost indisputable logic to what you're saying. I wonder where you think environmentalism will go. We're seeing increasingly with Extinction Rebellion and groups like that, more radical activism.
Yeah.
And there are theories that we will sort of soon see eco-terrorism. And I wondered if under a Trump administration that might actually be a more live danger.
Yeah. Let me just offer one quick other. I was going to interrupt you there, but I thought that you finished. So one of the other things that Paul Marshall said, and I guess he'd been talking with his Sir Jim Ratcliffe, that INEOS is going to move a lot of its operations out of Britain and into the U.S. Yeah. So as I'm a complete homer when it comes to the U.S. I'm like, I'm very proud to be American. I'm long U.S. I think we're still in an incredibly advantageous situation, demographics, geography. But because of cheap energy, we're going to see an influx of more and more industry from Europe because we have the rule of law, we have cheap energy, we have a reasonably good workforce. So what Britain's loss is going to be America's gain. And I say that with no pleasure being here because I love London, but I think this is obvious. But to your question, I've watched these NGOs for a long time. I don't call them environmental groups; they're activist groups. They're climate groups. I don't use the term fossil fuels. They're hydrocarbons, right? I don't use renewable or clean energy. It's alternative energy, right? The terms matter. But these NGOs, it is very clear, and you listen to what they are saying, and it makes perfect sense from a political standpoint. They know that they can't. They're not going to get traction in Washington now under Trump. So what are they doing? They're going to state and local levels to push climate policy. This is obvious, and they've said it very clearly. But they have also made clear, and Extinction Rebellion, some of these other ones, they are going to do, just as you said, more of this. I think of them as kind of a public terrorist. I mean, in terms of what they're doing to disrupt the public sphere, blocking roads, defacing public monuments, Stonehenge. I mean, these egotistical think they are.
Yeah.
That they have the license to go and be destroyers of the current culture. I'm just thinking, who do you think you are that you have but the self-righteousness that they have and the blinders that they have and their at ways they're attacking these Van Gogh paintings. We're going to go to the National Gallery, I think, later today, and see the painting that they threw the soup on. But I mean, there's a whole other philosophical part of this that we could get into about what is motivating this nihilistic outlook among these youngsters. I have children there that that age or a little younger, or that my kids would be older than some of these activists, but. What kind of a world outlook? How hopeless are they that they're doing this truly insane kind of public acts? And I think one of them from Extinction Rebellion was sentenced to 7 years in prison for blocking a road. The two women who threw the soup on the Van Gogh painting, I think they're in prison for 2 years. I hope they like it there.
Well, they are. If those groups do increasingly behave as terrorist groups, cells, the reaction against them, public reaction against them, will be pretty strong. So that raises an interesting question: what do the Democrats or perhaps the Labour Party do here, or the Green Party do here? Do they cheerlead for increasingly radical and disruptive people, or do they try and come up with their own sensible response to? Let's just talk about the Democrats. Their own sensible response to the Trump administration.
Yeah, did you say sensible and Democrats? I'm in the same sentence there. I think you said.
Yeah. They are okay. Some Democrats are okay.
No, fair enough. Look, and my politics. I don't consider myself Republican or Democrat. I'm disgusted. Okay, so I've been a reporter for a long time, but right now I see the Democrats in complete disarray. Right, they don't have a logical candidate for president in 2028. They are now completely backfooted on nearly every front by Trump. And are some of the things as I'm watching it, what Trump is doing, do they make sense and are long overdue? Yes. Are some of these things he said, some of the things he said about Ukraine, I'm thinking, he is a total lunatic, but there are parts of what he's doing that I could kiss the guy, right? On offshore wind, for instance, putting the, and ending a lot of this and saying out loud what I've known for years, because I've followed it for 15 years, that rural Americans don't want big solar and wind projects in their neighborhoods, right? And all these solar panels are made in China. And so, the fact that he would say that out loud and the fact that Chris Wright would the other day label net zero as sinister. I mean, it really is a new time. So it's going to take a while for the Democrats to formulate some kind of effective opposition. But to be effective, they're going to have to recraft their entire energy message, because without rural Americans, they can't win the White House. And their hold in rural America, I published a map the other day on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, showing there are nearly 2,600 out of the 3,100 counties in America voted for Trump. I mean, you look at any kind of geographical distribution of his voters, and overwhelmingly, United States is, Trump country, right? And in Oklahoma, Harris didn't win a single county. I'm from Oklahoma, right? So it's a sea of red.
Well, Robert Bryce, we'll end it there. But thank you so much for coming to The Spectator. It's a great, great pleasure to have you in the office.
It's fantastic to be with you, Freddie.